webinar on building support for affordable communities, a summary of research and opinion on messaging. My name is Amy Clark, and I'm Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Housing Conference. Joining me on this webinar is Janet Severos, the Research Associate at NHC's Center for Housing Policy. I'd like to thank Capital One for sponsoring NHC's webinar series. Any opinions or errors, however, are ours alone. This research is part of NHC's work to provide the housing community with resources that will help us build our collective capacity to communicate effectively about affordable housing. NHC works to help ensure safe, decent, and affordable housing for all Americans. We engage in evidence-based advocacy, we provide tools for effective communication, and we deepen our understanding of housing issues through the research of the Center for Housing Policy. Final few introductory notes. First, let's cover our most frequently asked question. Is this being recorded? Yes. An archived copy of this webinar will be made available. We'll send a link out to everyone who registered once the recording is online. Second, please note that all participant lines are muted in order to ensure clear sound quality for everyone. However, we will be taking questions. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please submit it through the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. That's the box I've outlined in red here in this screenshot. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Finally, let's address technical difficulties. While we hope that the webinar runs smoothly for everyone, we all know this doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Help menu at the top of the GoToWebinar control panel to locate technical support. If that doesn't work, please visit the GoToWebinar support website at support.citrixonline.com. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Janet.
Thank you, Amy. Today I'm going to start the webinar off by talking about our report, Building Support for Affordable Communities, Focusing the Message and Expanding the Base. This report, which we released in 2013, reviews existing research on affordable housing communication. And the research fell into two areas. The first is public opinion research, which focuses on how the public feels about affordable housing and whether it thinks it's a problem that needs to be addressed. And the second area of research is on language and messaging, which delves into how people react to different terms and ideas and what generates the most support because it resonates the best. I want to note that the research in our paper and on this topic is limited in nature and in some cases conflicting. Responses to surveys differ when you look at whether it was administered at the national level or at the state level. People's opinions about affordability problems are different at the national versus the state level. And also, it depends on when these studies were conducted. Opinions were different in some cases before the housing crisis and after the housing crisis. But despite some of these conflicts and some of the gaps, there were some key findings that emerged from the research that we looked at. So what I'm going to do now is delve into some of these findings in the hope that they'll be a good starting point for discussion and thinking about how to effectively communicate about affordable housing. The first finding is probably not a surprise to anyone, and it's that housing cost issues have the most traction in high-cost areas. People who live in communities with very high housing costs can better understand why their neighbors and others in their area might struggle to afford their rent or their mortgage because they can see that prices are high and problematic. A 2006 national survey illustrated this very well. The survey found that 14% of the people that they questioned identified housing costs as their most worrisome economic problem. Now, when the researchers broke out the responses by the kind of housing market, they found some big differences. When they looked at responses in higher cost housing markets, they found that identification of housing costs as a problem was much higher. That almost 30% of the people they questioned in a high-cost market thought that housing was the greatest problem they faced. And And when they looked at lower cost markets, they found that only 10% of the people they questioned thought that housing costs in particular were the greatest problem. So it can be easier to talk about housing affordability in very high cost areas. One of the things that we also wanted to gauge was how public opinion has changed in response to the housing crisis. There have only been a few studies since the crisis, and it raises some interesting questions. So we looked at an annual national survey that gauges attitudes towards homeownership. And this particular survey found that worries about housing affordability peaked when home prices peaked, and then steadily declined after that point. However, when you look at some of the more recent state-level surveys, we found that there are still very widespread concerns when it comes to housing affordability. In particular, a 2010 survey of Rhode Islanders found that over 80% of the people they talked with explained that their state had a housing affordability problem, even though home prices were dropping, even as they were answering the survey. So there are still widespread concerns that aren't always tied to home prices in an area.
All right. So one of the ways you can help folks in your community understand the severity of the housing challenge, whether or not you live in a place with high housing costs, is to couch the data you use in terms that people can understand easily. The truth is that most of us don't think in terms of numbers as much as we think in terms of stories. And we certainly don't remember numbers the way we remember stories. So it can be hard to use even carefully chosen data in a way that our audiences can easily comprehend. That's where the concept of social math comes in. Social math is a way of taking big, unfamiliar numbers and putting them into a familiar context. So this is a picture of FedEx Field, which is the home of the greater D.C. area professional football franchise. FedEx Field holds about 92,000 people. According to the National Alliance on Homelessness, as of 2014, there are more than 92,000 homeless individuals in our country. So what does 92,000 people look like? If you just give it to me as a number, I'm not really sure. It's a big number, but it's difficult to conceptualize. When you tell me that there are enough chronically homeless people in the United States to fill FedEx Field, I can picture exactly what that looks like. Understanding the magnitude of the problem is a stepping stone to understanding what it will take to fix it. Social math can help us get there. Another thing to think about is how we choose some of the data points. For example, we talk a lot about cost burden, and that's a great number to use, but it's easy for people to say, well, I had to pay too much money for my rent when I was younger or when I was just starting out, and then my life changed, and it was only a temporary situation. So to kind of balance that, we also need to focus on the shortage of affordable housing, which is something that people are less aware of.
One of the other findings to emerge from the research is that housing cost concerns are often passive and do not translate into political support. So some of these studies that asked people if they thought housing affordability was a major problem found that even people who responded that they did believe housing costs were a major problem also expressed that they were unlikely to actually do anything about it, unlikely to support any affordable housing initiatives or take any political action. The research doesn't really establish why this is. However, it did suggest some possible reasons, which many of you may have encountered personally. The first is that there may be some people out there who do strongly believe that something needs to be done to improve housing affordability, but they just don't understand what it is that they can do, what actions that can be taken in their own community. There are also people who think that housing affordability is important, but it's just one of many other concerns or other policy priorities that they have, and it just doesn't rise to the top. There are also people who support the idea of affordable housing in the abstract, but are actually uncomfortable when they're thinking about locating affordable housing in their own community. There is one study that we found that tried to delve into this issue by speaking with policymakers who expressed support for housing affordability initiatives personally, but hadn't taken any action publicly. And these policymakers described that what they found is that there was very little reward and substantial risk if they actually publicly took on these housing affordability issues.
So it sounds like what we need to do is help people's thinking move from the abstract to the concrete and help policymakers understand the rewards that come with building and preserving affordable homes. Building some aspirational thinking into our messaging and providing concrete solutions can help us with this. We need to talk not just about what's wrong, but about what right looks like. If there are problems we want to solve, then yes, it's important to articulate what those problems are. But if we just talk problems, we run the risk of causing folks to think that the problems are too big or too hard to solve. Help your audience get excited about the solutions that you're proposing by showing them your aspirations. Paint a picture of what your community could look like when everyone has access to a home that you can afford. We also need to be conscious not just of what we're saying today, but of the story we're telling over time. So the other day, a friend of mine posted a screenshot on Facebook of the subject lines of every email he received in the last few months from a political organization. Every subject line was something like, enormous loss, or some tough news, or kid you not, doomed. Why would I take action if over time what you're telling me is that no matter what I do, we're doomed? Part of talking about solutions is showing how solutions have worked in the past and are working over time now. We need to show what success is.
Another finding to emerge from the research we looked at is that homeownership solutions tend to be more attractive to the public than rental solutions. One study really highlighted this. They found that a little over half the people they spoke with said they were comfortable with locating affordable homes in their neighborhood. But when the researchers followed up to ask about how they felt about affordable homes to buy, the support actually grew to 61%. And when they asked about affordable homes to rent, support actually fell to 39%. So it's important to think about what people are comfortable with. Some more recent research points to the fact that providing the public with context may actually help to build support for affordable rental initiatives. This survey actually gave the respondents some information about current national housing policy and the growing popularity of renting, and then asked what the respondents thought about what housing policy should focus on, and they found that 65% agreed with the statement that housing and policy should focus more equally on initiatives to address the needs of both homeowners and renters. So this points to the potential of education and context to really helping frame for the public how important rental initiatives are as well. The research, unsurprisingly, indicates that since the housing crisis, more people are personally familiar with housing affordability challenges. A 2012 study in Long Island found that 6 in 10 people that they spoke with reported at least some difficulty paying their rent or mortgage. Some of this research points to how personal experience with housing cost challenges could lead to greater support for housing affordability initiatives. However, there isn't much research on that at this point. Some other surveys point that this actually may be a hindrance to gathering support for affordable housing initiatives. A national survey found that 35% of the people they spoke with resented government assistance to underwater borrowers who couldn't afford their mortgages. So what this says to me is that it's not quite clear how resentment among people who may have their own housing cost challenges but may not be eligible for programs in their area or may not even be aware of programs in their area might not translate into support for affordable housing programs in general. And it will take some effort to really harness some of the personal feelings people have and explain to them how affordable housing initiatives could benefit them.
All right, so it's sounding like people are starting to really get affordable housing challenges and understanding the impact that they have. What are the ways we can leverage this is by consistently using language that enforces the idea that affordable housing is everyone's problem and that the solutions benefit everyone as well. So if you've ever traveled to Japan, you've probably encountered the phenomenon of manner posters. There's signs all over the subway and some other public spaces that encourage people to be considerate of others and follow the rules. This poster that I'm showing you a picture of has Rodin thinker taking up too much room on the subway. And the caption essentially says, "Let's be considerate about disturbing those around us." All these manner posters use a lot of us, we, our, and let. This is the kind of language that can subtly get across the idea that we're talking about something that's everyone's problem and that everyone is part of the solution. One of the things that we run into as housing advocates is this idea that I think Janet got across, that folks who need help with their housing are not like us. In truth, we all benefit from affordable housing, even if we aren't personally living in a quote-unquote affordable home. Families become stable, neighborhoods become stable, there are fewer disruptions in the classroom, it goes on and on, right? So instead of telling a housing story about some mysterious gem, use the language that will allow you to tell a housing story about us.
Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and move on to the research on language and messaging. This research really looked at what kind of terms and phrasing was most effective at helping people to understand what affordable housing is and developing support. So one of the first recommendations to emerge from the research is to focus on specific beneficiaries. The term affordable housing is very vague to most people. It doesn't have a common definition or understanding. So when you describe a program's target population using an income range, such as households earning $25,000 to $40,000, or a qualifier like young families just starting out, it can help the public to understand why these households may struggle to find affordable housing in their community and better understand why it's important to develop a program to help these families in particular.
So in the end, I think what the majority of us really care about are the things that are happening in our own communities. Your audience wants to know about how all this housing stuff relates to the world that we live in. We can use local narratives and regional narratives, the stories that we share about the places we live, to tell the housing story. So as Janet suggested from the research, using local data about what workers in your community earn and what they can afford to spend on their mortgage or their rent can be incredibly effective. It's much more effective, I think, than throwing out the AMI numbers. I also encourage you to reach back into the history of your community to tell a story about how affordable homes used to be. I think just about every community has that story. For me, when my parents moved to the suburbs of Seattle in the early 70s, they were able to buy a house for just over twice their father's annual income. That sounds incredible to me now, and that kind of story is, I think, a really distant memory in most places and for most people. But it shows how much more accessible housing was, and it can remind your audience of the benefits that that kind of opportunity provided for folks who lived in your community. You can leverage these stories to tell a new story about what our communities can be like if there's more affordable housing available for everyone.
The next recommendation to come out of the research is that it can be helpful to describe programs in ways that affirm that the target population deserves assistance. Many people have negative assumptions and stereotypes when they think about who lives in affordable housing. And it can be very helpful to talk about the people you're targeting using terms like working families, positive connotations that can help people in the community relate to who is being served by the program. The next thing is also to talk about how the community benefits from a particular initiative or program, not just the target population for that program. In a 2009 survey in Massachusetts, almost 2/3 of the people surveyed reported that they believed the lack of affordable housing harms their local economy. And over 70% of them agreed that high housing costs prevented young families from moving into their community and elderly residents from being able to stay in their community. So it can be very useful to talk to the public about how an affordable housing program can help address those concerns. By creating affordable housing, you help families to have more money left in their budget at the end of the month that they can then spend in the local economy and drive growth. Affordable housing also makes it possible for young families to move into the community and older residents to stay even as housing costs rise, and to create a really dynamic and diverse community that's valued by people who live there. While it's important to acknowledge how the community benefits, it's also important to address some of the concerns people have about the possible negative impacts of affordable housing on the community. A 2004 survey summed up some of these common concerns fairly well and identified that most of the people they spoke with believe that affordable housing would worsen traffic congestion, school quality, decrease property values, and attract the wrong kind of people. It's important to address these concerns that people have with existing research that shows that in most cases affordable housing doesn't have these negative impacts, and to also talk about the measures in your particular program that will address some of these concerns. Another recommendation is to appeal to core values that many people hold, such as choice, hard work, balance, fairness, opportunity. One study that gathered focus groups spoke about gentrification, and most of the focus groups members agreed that people shouldn't be forced to leave their communities because they can't afford the rising housing costs. So it can be helpful to talk about how it's only fair to create programs that will help long-standing residents to stay in their community if they want to, and to help hardworking households to afford housing in a place where they live. Another suggestion is to talk about housing as a consumer issue instead of a social issue. Sometimes when you talk about housing as a social issue, you're just preaching to the choir. But when you talk about housing as a consumer issue, you can reach people who are less concerned about the social impact. So if you frame it in terms of market-based values of choice, variety, and balance, you can help people to understand how an adequate supply of housing of different price points and different variety is good for all consumers because it keeps prices low and it offers people lots of choices in housing.
All right, so as Janet just described, there are shared values like opportunity and choice that we can use to connect with our audiences. One great resource for learning more about using values in your communications is the Opportunity Frame Toolkit from the Opportunity Agenda. If you haven't heard of the Opportunity Agenda, they're a national group that focuses on a spectrum of social justice issues, and their toolkit is great because it's a comic book featuring Helvetica Bold, who's a social justice superhero, but it's a really good look at how to use the frame or the sort of value of opportunity throughout communication, and you get a look at how different issue areas can use the frame, which I think is helpful as you're thinking about how to use it yourself.
And the final thoughts that I would like to leave you all with in terms of the research side of this discussion is a recent survey that was released in the spring after our report was released. It's the How Housing Matters survey, and that's now in its second year. And there are some key findings that emerged from the recent survey that are important to keep in mind as you think about how to communicate about affordable housing. And the first is that nearly half of Americans have dealt with insecure housing at some point. So it really bolsters some of the other research I discussed about the fact that more and more people know what it's like to struggle with housing costs and insecure housing and have a better understanding of that challenge. The survey also found that nearly 60% of the people they spoke with believe that the federal government should invest equally in affordable rental and homeownership initiatives. So there's the potential that people are better understanding the need for a balanced housing policy for both renting and home buying. And finally, the majority of the people they surveyed believe that state and local governments should do more to ensure there's a sufficient number of affordable homes to rent and buy. So there's the potential that a growing number of the public believes that it's time to take action to address these housing affordability problems in their community.
Okay, so to end my section, I want to talk a little bit about the role of government. So you know that federal and state and local government has a big role to play in affordable housing. And as Janet just described, it seems like a lot of Americans are really coming to understand that the government does have a role in making affordable housing available. But there are still so many negative narratives about government that are really hurting us and hurting our advocacy efforts. I'm sure you can think of a lot of them. You know, there's the government as a vending machine. You put money in and you get something out for yourself. Government as a boxing match, donkeys and elephants fighting each other and nothing gets done. This doesn't help us. But one really effective and proven term that you can use to talk about government is public structure. So just like the public school system is public structure that gives every American child the opportunity to succeed, our federal government and state and local governments provide public structures that give Americans access to housing they can afford. As part of talking about housing includes the role of a state housing trust fund, for example. You can describe that housing trust fund as being a public structure that your state provides to ensure your neighbors have access to affordable homes. Public structure avoids negative frames the way that some of our messaging about government can get into, and it really gets to the heart of what the government role is all about. If you want to learn more about this term public structure and the research that developed it, check out Public Works. They're a great organization that's done a lot of good research about communication. All right, so now it's time for questions. I'm going to try to find them here. So we encourage you to ask us your questions. Use the comment box in the GoToWebinar field there, and we will take a look at your questions right now and see what we can answer. All right, so the most popular question we always get is, will we be making the materials available? Yes, absolutely. We're recording this webinar, and we will also we'll make that and the slides available. We'll send out an email to everyone who's registered with links to where they can be downloaded. So look out for that within a couple days after the webinar is finished. All right, the questions are coming in. Thank you very much. Okay, the first question is from Lisa. She says, my organization administers Section 8 vouchers, and garnering public opinion for that program can be very challenging. Do you have any recommendations on how to message subsidized housing specifically? Janet, anything about that in the research?
There's nothing specific in the research, but I definitely can appreciate that when you're talking about Section 8 vouchers, people have some very strong assumptions and stereotypes in their head. And so the challenge is to, I think, replace what they think of when they think about who lives in Section 8 voucher housing. So I think what can be helpful is to really focus on who has vouchers in your program. Are these people who are working in the schools? Are they working in the community? Are they retail workers in the community? And really helping people to understand that the people who are using this program are hardworking families that are just trying to do the same things that the public is, trying to provide for their families, provide for their children, and really try and reshape what people think of. I think there have been some campaigns that I came across when I was doing some of the research that utilized posters and had actual pictures of people who lived in the community, described their income, and described how far short they fell of being able to afford housing in that area.
I imagine, Janet, that some market or consumer messages might be helpful here as well, since these are folks who the market isn't serving, particularly people who are maybe disabled or seniors on fixed income. It's easy to imagine that someone with that kind of fixed income wouldn't be able to afford what the market provides. And like you were saying, the market framework is something that people understand and they see themselves as consumers, so that could help as well. All right, Lisa, thank you for that question. Well, we have a request from Margaret to help her find the How Housing Matters survey. Margaret, we can provide a link to that survey in the email that we send out to everyone who registered. Thanks for asking for that. All right, Todd asks, can you provide some best practice examples from around the country on affordable housing advocacy campaigns? I have a thought about that. Janet, did you come across advocacy campaigns in particular in your research?
No, we didn't focus as much on advocacy campaigns. However, one thing that this does bring to mind is not a best practice per se, but an innovative practice that we did find is one affordable housing provider actually surveyed neighbors in their area where they had some affordable developments and actually had some really positive responses from neighbors who were pleased with the design of the affordable housing, the management of the affordable housing, and the residents there. So that kind of local information, I would imagine, can be very effective in local advocacy campaigns.
So I'm going to fast forward a little bit in the slides here and show you the Housing Communications Hub. So the Housing Communications Hub is an online community that we developed that's available free to anyone who's interested in becoming a more effective housing communicator. It's a place to learn more and share strategies that work, and we have a resource library on the Hub that has examples of campaigns from around the country that people have shared. So I encourage you to go to the Hub, create an account, browse the resource library, and if you have questions or if there's something that you'd like people to share, you can use the discussion section to ask those questions or to see if people have ideas that can help you. So thanks for that question. All right, Arla asks if we'll be presenting any information on employer-assisted housing, or if we have information about employer-assisted housing as it relates to this communication material. Anything about employer-assisted housing in the research?
There was nothing specific to employer-assisted housing, although there was some research that really tried to gauge what impact the lack of affordable housing has on an employer, whether it can be a challenge to recruiting and retention. And a lot of employers identified that it was a challenge, but very few of them actually had done anything about it. So there weren't a lot of good examples of employer-assisted housing programs, but it definitely highlighted the need and the potential for these employer-assisted housing programs to not just benefit a community, but to benefit an employer to recruit and retain talented individuals.
I think that's a challenge that we have sort of more broadly is communicating about these issues to the business community, particularly in markets where, as is the case in many places around the country right now, where there are many more workers or many more people in search of jobs than there are jobs. And so even if an employer understands that, his employees have very long commutes because they can't afford to live close by, if they quit, it's not as much of a problem for that employer because there's a line do you want your workers to be to have good quality of life? Do you want your workers to be spending all of their time commuting as opposed to on the job? Do you want them to be more available to relax? But it's a difficult issue, I think, to deal with. All right, Joaquin asks if we have ideas on addressing the challenge of messaging homes for the quote-unquote workforce. People at 80% of AMI down to 40% of AMI versus homes for people with extremely low income, up to 30% of AMI. And those tend to be multifamily units that communities are often against. What about multifamily?
I think what we found in the research is that there wasn't a lot in surveys that distinguish multifamily from single family. It's usually lumped into homes to buy versus homes to rent. And that's certainly changed a little bit since the housing crisis, but there are certainly more places where people are renting single-family homes. So a lot of the research focuses on how to make the case for rental housing in general. And trying to help people to understand in a lot of communities, there's a very small supply of rental housing. And trying to get across the importance of balancing not only having enough rental housing, but having housing to have people at all income levels, to have that balance in your community. It's certainly a challenge in some places to advocate for multifamily housing. So it can be effective to go back to that market-based messaging again of this is about variety and supply and giving people choices. Not everyone wants to live in a single-family home. People may be able to relate to the importance of multifamily housing for older adults. As they age, a single-family home might not be adequate, and they might also struggle with fixed incomes and not being able to afford to maintain a single-family home, and really tying it to who would be living in some of these affordable, lower-income multifamily units. As Amy mentioned before, it could be people with physical impairments, older adults, people that should have a place in your community but might not be able to afford it.
I suppose this is cold comfort, but my understanding of some of the research the National Multifamily Housing Council has done is that a lot of the objections that we hear to multifamily housing for people who are extremely low income or formerly homeless, it's the same objections for market rate apartments as there are for low income apartments, and there's just sort of a distaste in some quarters for multifamily housing for all the sort of traffic and crowding and congestion and fear of losing things that people have across the board, and that extra layer that we have to deal with as affordable housing advocates is often that layer of bias against the people who will be living there themselves. The bias can take on very specific characteristics. We've done some research here into building community acceptance for that kind of development, and one of the, there's essentially a lot of, I think, community organizing that has to go into building that support on the part of the developer or the sponsor of the development, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with what the local community itself does to the jurisdiction, the city or the county does to lay the groundwork and create a framework for that happening. And so in some ways, it has less to do with even the communication techniques than it has to do with this is something that we as a city, as a community, have decided we're going to do, and this is the framework we're creating for doing it, and this is these are the boundaries we're putting around the community discussion and that kind of thing. I think it maybe goes even beyond the general public opinion that we're talking about. All right. Margaret asks, what did you find the most surprising or most useful piece of information in this research?
I'd have to say what I found to be the most surprising was the identification of resentment among a significant share of the public towards some of the housing crisis-related affordable housing programs, so the assistance for underwater homeowners. And really understanding that there might be a real challenge in talking about affordable housing programs to people who have struggled with housing affordability but may not be eligible for this particular program. And I think it brings to mind the importance of really communicating how the whole community benefits, as we touched on before, that even if you aren't the target audience for this initiative or this program, there are ways in which you would benefit by its existence in your community. So really being aware of that resentment was something that surprised me. In terms of the most useful piece of information in the research, I think some of the languaging and the messaging information is particularly useful in terms of thinking about how to talk about affordable housing in a way that makes it clear and specific for people so that they can picture it in their mind, and being very intentional about how you go about talking about who could be served by the program and helping people to really understand how the program is going to work and why it's important in their community.
Thanks for that question, Margaret. Mary asked us if we've identified effective campaigns for accessible workforce housing, so people with disabilities, family members with disabilities, anything like that in the research?
The research didn't focus as much on campaigns. It really focused mostly on public opinion and language and messaging. But I think some of the methods certainly can be used when you're talking about workforce housing, talking about there's a need in your community for people who work there to be able to live there as well. And talking about accessible housing kind of comes back to needing this variety of different housing types that accommodate all needs. So people need housing that's accessible if they have some kind of disability, and pointing out that that's missing in your community can help to make the case that there needs to be more variety.
All right, thanks for that question, Mary. Mark asked us, based on the research, are there any specific recommendations that can be given to community-based nonprofits in making the case for affordable housing to local elected officials and community groups who may be holding on to NIMBYism? That's not in my backyardism for anyone who's acronym averse.
The research didn't delve into recommendations for how to really make the case to local elected officials, but I do think the information that emerged about why a lot of local officials are unwilling to do something that they feel that there's little reward and significant risk is really important. So I think what it comes down to is thinking about how you can increase the reward and reduce the risk for them. So thinking about how you can help local officials sell these ideas to the community and how you can support them and their work and really help them to kind of see what the reward is for them and see how it helps them to really promote these initiatives and programs, I think is probably a more effective way to go about it.
Thank you, Mark, for the question. Maybe one or two more here. A little praise from Michael, thank you. And then Katie asked, can you talk more about shortage of affordable housing versus cost burden, and do we have some examples of this? So in terms of talking about the shortage of affordable housing, both the Urban Institute and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition have great numbers on the gap between the number of people in need of affordable housing at different income levels and the amount of housing that's affordable and available to them. And in most communities, it's a very shocking number. So, you know, it would be, I'm making this up essentially, but, you know, in a lot of communities, it's like there are, 38 rental units that are affordable and available to every 100 people at 30% of median and below who need them. And there's some research that suggests that this can be an even more effective number to talking about that shortage, than just talking about the amount of income that people need to spend. I think it's important to show that number, and I think unfortunately, what we run into no matter what number we use, right, is the sort of cynicism or I don't know, sort of blase, I'm over it feeling that people have around, well, of course, if your income is low, if you're poor, it's going to be hard for you to afford things. That's what being poor is. And so I think when these numbers end up being the most effective is when it's middle-income people who are having a hard time affording their housing. I think we have seen in the past few months, unfortunately, the New York Times and elsewhere, with the shocking news that middle-income people are having a hard time affording rent in their communities. And so now it's interesting because it's the middle class who's having the problem. So I think either way it can be difficult, but that's where you bolster numbers with stories about what it really means for the working person or the person on fixed income who is struggling to get by, and what that means to their daily life and what consequences that has for themselves and for their communities. Katie, thanks for that question. Okay. I think a couple more. Thank you for continuing to give us questions. All right. So Lindsay, the Urban Institute and the National Low Income Housing Coalition both do great looks at that affordable housing gap. I think Urban has some really nice interactive maps. So, and the coalition does a good report every year as well. So, National Low Income Housing Coalition and the Urban Institute are both good resources for you. And of course, the National Housing Conference has good numbers as well from our Housing Landscape report and from our Paycheck to Paycheck report, if you want to take a look at those as well. All right, Chris asks, in high-growth communities, local school boards are very wary of adding single home or family housing due to added stress on school systems. These are also the communities that need more affordable rental units. This discussion with city officials probably needs to take a different tack, don't you think? Janet, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a challenging discussion, and this is one of those fears that I talked about. And in some cases, there are legitimate concerns about how to respond to a growing population, and it's difficult for school systems to keep up in some cases as the community grows. But I think it's a discussion that is challenging, but I think it's important for local communities to have a plan and then to actually communicate that plan. When a new affordable housing development or any kind of housing development is proposed, I think it can be more effective for the local government to explain how they plan to address this in the school system, what kinds of changes this would require, and have representatives not just from the local planning department, but also from the local school district, and to show that you have local officials of all the different parts of government working together and aware of how the community is changing and working together to respond to it.
And I think, frankly, it's much more stressful on a classroom, on a school system, when you have kids who are showing up without having eaten because their parents are paying rent instead of buying food because they have to make that choice, or they can't afford medication, or there are school districts in our country that have elementary schools that are dedicated for kids whose families are homeless. I'm sure there are many teachers and many principals who can tell the story of what it's like to have a lot of kids in their schools who move multiple times a year, and what that does for learning, not just for that individual child, but for the classroom as a whole when learning is disrupted when a kid is behind and the teacher has to spend a lot of time with him because his family has to move because they can't afford housing. I think, if we use messengers who can tell those kinds of stories that aren't just about the kids who are having the problem, but the impact on the entire landscape, on the entire school, the impact on your kid, not just the impact on the kid whose family is having problems. I think that's something that can help change the conversation as well. Chris, thanks for that question. All right, George asks us if there are any examples or case studies of private, government, nonprofit housing coming together to develop TOD projects. Anything in the research?
Not in this particular research report. However, there is a lot of research that my colleague Robert Hickey has been working on, as well as some other organizations, really following efforts in cities that are creating new transit development. The first one that comes to mind is Denver, as well as the Twin Cities are undergoing major expansion of their transit. And you do have private, government, and nonprofit groups that are coming together as transit is expanding and being developed, and being very intentional about preserving existing affordable housing, as well as creating land trusts and land banks to create new affordable housing to respond to the expected rise in housing costs. So I definitely recommend that you peruse our website to take a look at some of the work that has been done here at the center. There is also the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, shorthand CTOD, is doing some research as well. I think some of their research has looked at some of the expansion in Los Angeles. So there's a lot of case studies of how you have different groups really working together for affordable housing in relation to TOD.
George, thank you for that question. I would also recommend for this question, and for anyone else who's looking for information on specific types of campaigns or types of materials or that kind of thing, go to the hub, ask the question in the discussion forum. There are folks who are active on the discussion forum regularly and are looking at people's questions and often chime in and will share campaigns that they've seen or other materials that they've seen and would think would be helpful. So the hub, I think, is a great place to ask that question as well. So it looks like we don't have any more questions at this time. Thanks, everyone, for being engaged. These are some really great questions that certainly made me think. I want to make you all aware of some upcoming webinars. With the help of Capital One, we hold webinars regularly on a variety of housing policy and research topics. The soonest webinar we have coming up is on inclusionary upzoning. This is about a new report that our colleague Robert is releasing next week. This webinar is on Thursday, and I encourage you to sign up for it. It should be interesting. And if you want to get even deeper into some of these ideas about messaging and values and framing, I suggest you join us on August 12th for a webinar on 10 scientifically proven ways advocates can speak differently and get results. So I hope to see you all on one or more of those webinars. And I also want to encourage you to reach out and get in touch with us. We're happy to answer questions, and we appreciate hearing from you. So thanks to everyone for being part of this webinar and for your great questions. And thanks again to Capital One for its financial support of our webinar series. Have a great day, everyone.